You're listening to the Vent Podcast, where we bring you interviews and stories from around the world of wine and spirits. From winemakers and critics to sommeliers and master distillers, we'll explore the people and businesses who are instrumental in shaping the future of today's food and drinks culture. Enjoy the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Vent Podcast. My name is Brady, joined in the studio by my whiskey-loving co-host, Billy Galanko. How you doing, Billy?
Doing well. I'm excited for a nice whiskey-focused episode this week. I prepared, well, not exactly on topic, but I had an interesting Japanese whiskey over the weekend, so I'm ready to roll.
Nice. Was this your Mizunara cask whiskey?
Yeah, it was a Shinobu Mizunara cask, so it's pretty cool. They're trying to basically shake things up there in Japan, so it's kind of a cool thing to taste.
Was it like a pale yellowish color, or was it more dark?
Yeah.
Amber, or what?
Yeah, it was only a 10-year and it was finished in Mizunara cask. It wasn't completely aged.
Okay.
Didn't have too much character, but it was enough to notice, which is unique.
Nice. Yeah, we have on today's episode, we have an interview with, I was going to call them up and coming. I guess they are still up and coming, but have gained so much traction, especially in online whiskey review platforms, sort of the whiskey communities and other places on the internet have given a lot of airtime to Found North Whiskey, a Canadian whiskey project founded by two brothers, Nick and Zach Taylor, who we're excited to have on today for an interview on the podcast. And theirs is a story, I think, that for folks who, even for folks who aren't into whiskey, I think they did a great job at telling the story of whiskey, both in, as maybe we know it in Scotch in Scotland, as we know American whiskey and especially bourbon here. I see their project and this kind of style of Canadian is blending those two things together. I think they do a good job of telling that story.
Yeah. Now the more I've gotten into my little whiskey studies here, the more I was intrigued by the nuance of Canadian whiskey. And I didn't realize that people don't really put much time onto it. And a lot of time people think that everything when it comes to blending, like when it's a bourbon, for example, is all just you read X% of corn, X% of rye, X% of barley is the mash bills. Well, in Canada, they'll ferment each of these and distill them all separately, and then they can blend later on. So that was something that I had kind of read. And then these guys just totally blew my mind on the layers of depth and flavor that they're getting and their approach to actually making a blended whiskey. So it's really cool.
Yeah, I think the special thing about the style of making whiskey is the number of levers that you can pull in terms of
Canadian whiskey too.
With Canadian whiskey, between blending and obviously before blending, the variety of barrel selection and the broad range of whiskey that you can bring into the blending process, yet alone talking about how the final quote unquote mash or blend is constructed in terms of the different grains. So a lot of different levers to pull. They're doing some really cool stuff. Some of the whiskeys that we tried, we actually got some samples from them, and we'll talk about one of them, I think, in depth on the episode, but they're using sherry casks for finishing, Hungarian oak casks for both maturation and finishing, I believe. And I think their plans are to really continue experimenting and expanding and, like I said, pulling those levers that make these whiskeys so special.
Yeah, it was cool to hear they're open to trying a number of different casks. It sounds like they're going to be doing a lot of experimenting. They were talking about Gariana casks on the episode, which I actually accidentally said Mariana casks, and they luckily just blew by. It wasn't a trench, it's a cask. Which Gariana is a really cool oak from the Pacific Northwest, and I don't know if it's still as protected, but they used to have to wait till the trees would fall down, and then they would harvest the wood that was left. I assume they're not rotten, and rather than cutting them down. But that was really cool to hear about. Also, yeah, when you were mentioning the samples, shout out to their team. They sent us samples, and for some reason in my apartment complex, those samples disappeared. Not sure where they went. And they were able to just basically overnight me another couple right before the show. So we had some really cool kind of in-depth conversation where we were able to experience their whiskey prior to actually talking about it, which is not always happening on the podcast.
Billy's in a pretty rough part of LA. So things are, if you're sending anything to Billy, let us know if we can.
That's the guy with sirens going on behind him.
Yeah,
but
this is like I said, we're glad to have Nick and Zach on. I've seen actually a number of folks do. They're very accessible founders. So I've seen a number of folks do kind of in-depth Q&As with them, but not a ton of podcast interviews, I don't think, out there. So we're excited to bring this to our listeners and hopefully to the broader whiskey community. If you're tuning in for the first time, thanks for joining. And here is our interview with founders of Found North, Nick and Zach Taylor. Hey, Nick, Zach, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much. We're excited to be here, Brady and Billy. Can't wait to do this.
I've been hearing buzz about Found North, your project, all over the internet, whiskey blogs, wherever you might find people talking about whiskey, they're talking about you guys. I think that's obviously really great for your business, but really great for Canadian whiskey overall. Why don't you just give our listeners maybe an introduction to your project and sort of how it all came about that you all work together?
Yeah, well, that's exciting to hear that, and we're really appreciative of that. So how do we get started? Always a simple question and a difficult one to answer, but really I'd say just a series of things came together for this project to happen. Going back a little bit, Nick and I, who are brothers and the co-founders of Found North Whiskey, we have been wanting to do something together since we were young. Just had a real interest in working together and partnering on something exciting that we thought would be fulfilling and challenging. So sort of started from that point. And then Nick, at an early age, just developed this really, really intense enthusiasm for whiskey and a really deep knowledge of whiskey. He hitchhiked through Scotland when he was 20, and he went all over Kentucky, he went to Japan, and he just had this very, very fervent excitement around whiskey. And so that sort of kicked off our interest in the subject. And I had sort of a different path. I got really interested in startups. Just the notion of building something, the kind of open-endedness and the ability to go in any direction you want and the control that gives you always was really, really appealing to me. And so I think those three factors kind of prepared us to start a whiskey brand together and become whiskey producers. In terms of Found North specifically, again, sort of a series of events that we were very fortunate to have experienced, I'd say, but the driving force for Found North itself is blending. Nick, coming from the whiskey background, had this very strong perspective, and I don't know whether it's still contrarian or not. That's sort of debatable. But he had this perspective that blending whiskey makes the best whiskey. Simple statement, but really the driving force behind Found North. We believe that blending is something that allows you to shape the whiskey in really positive ways and to make the best possible whiskey you can. And so for us, when we looked at that and we looked at the American whiskey landscape, and the emphasis on really front loading the production process, and then sort of the zeal for single barrels, the central focus on Indiana, Kentucky, and Tennessee as sources for the whiskey. It just sort of dawned on us that Canadian whiskey is very much designed for blending. And so once we sort of put that together, we started getting really interested. We started forming a thesis. And then I think when that thesis met reality, and we started tasting the quality of the whiskey that we were finding up there, not only the specs, the age, the way they had been made, the quality of the distillate that we were tasting. And then when we started blending those together, that's when we really found the sort of it factor in the whiskey that we were looking for, where it was ringing the bells we were looking for from great American whiskeys, great bourbons and ryes, but it was a little bit different. And for us, that was actually really compelling and really exciting rather than a deterrent. And so we sort of, that really was the sort of genesis of Found North is, hey, this Canadian whiskey is designed for blending. We really, really want to blend. That's what we want to do. And oh my gosh, the quality of the whiskeys we're getting is really, really resonating with us. And so that was about 3 years ago. And we started working on our first couple of blends, which took about a year. We launched the brand a little over 2 years ago.
Wow. So I don't think many people know that it's common in Canada to distill, say you have a spirit that has a certain amount of corn, certain amount of rye, certain amount of barley, to distill some of these spirits on their own and then blend them afterward, rather than most American whiskeys, you see the mash bill. They were all mashed together, fermented and distilled together. Can you explain a little bit about that and how that adds that nuance and kind of helped create or inspire you guys?
Yeah, the really interesting thing is that American and Canadian whiskey were made the same way, relatively similarly, for the first, 150 years. It really wasn't until the early 20th century where Canadians realized that they could add they could basically cultivate the enzymes that they needed. So basically in any American mash bill, you'll always see a proportion of barley in the mash bill. It's not really for flavor. It's there because the enzymes in the barley help convert starch to sugar. You need sugar to make alcohol. It's really an efficiency thing. And what the Canadians realized in the early 20th century was we don't need to add barley. We can just cultivate and add those enzymes. Now it's pretty much a universal practice in North America, but it's not talked about much. And so the Canadians are basically, they're saying, okay, we can control the yeast, we can control the fermentation temperature, we can control the distillation process, we can do everything for one specific grain to optimize the grain, and then we can do something completely different for the next grain, as opposed to saying, all right, we have 3 different grains in here, we need to kind of make everything work for everything. And that process really made Canadian whiskey the dominant whiskey in North America forever. The craziest thing about Canadian whiskey that most people forget or don't realize is Canadian whiskey has been the number 1 selling whiskey by volume in the United States from 1865 until 2010. Canadian whiskey is just, it was perfect for blending. But over the last, 30, 40 years, we've really seen the migration towards single malts, straight bourbons, these concepts of sort of purity. But really the funny thing is, if it's not a single barrel, it's almost certainly a blend, even if it's called a straight bourbon or a single malt or anything like that. And I think that was why that was one of the main reasons we were so attracted to Canadian whiskey, because it was very straightforward that we're going to blend this. It's going to be a blend. Even if it's all from the same distillery, it's still going to be a blend called a blend and made to give that freedom to the consumer. And so that was, to circle back to what Zach was saying and to sort of tie it into the Canadian process, that was fabulous for us. And these single grain components that we work with, you can really see a difference from a profile standpoint as you're working with them. A lot of the core components are very straight line. They're very, very easy to work with. You would think when you're blending, you would think, take my best whiskey and my second best whiskey. You got whiskey A, super complex, whiskey B, super complex. We put them together, we're going to get a super duper complex whiskey. And that's not true at all. It's kind of like making music. If you have a great drum solo and a great guitar solo and you lay them on top of each other, you're not going to make good music. You're going to make a lot of noise. And so when you're blending with Canadian, you have these whiskeys that are really optimized to have complexity and layers, and you have these other whiskeys that are really designed to complement those whiskeys. And it's a beautiful combination for us.
Yeah, and I think for Billy and I'll speak for myself, from coming from more of a wine background, or in terms of exploration and knowledge and into whiskey, it always felt like whiskey had far fewer levers to pull in terms of crafting a unique product each time. It sounds like sort of the I'll call it the Canadian approach, and maybe even the approach in Scotland, production of Scotch, is to really maximize the number of levers that you have to create a unique product and do that. Yeah, really make decisions all the way up until bottling that affect the final product. Is that kind of a great way to describe it?
That's part. Yeah, I mean that's exactly right.
So what's the difference between? Can you just draw some really easy differences between the production of bourbon as we know it, Scotch perhaps, and then Canadian whiskey generally?
Yeah, I mean, I think within these, of course, there are a bunch of subcategories. So bourbon, not so much, but even with bourbon, you have like bottled and bond, which has its own regulations, et cetera. But the real sort of straight line difference is mash bill versus the single grain. It doesn't just matter from a when we're combining the grain perspective. It also matters from a how much is each grain actually properly represented in the whiskey. And that has a lot to do with the starch content, the difference in starch content from corn to rye. Corn has about twice as much starch as rye. When you do a mash bill and it's 75% corn and 20% rye and 5% malted barley, the impression you're getting is that 20% of the liquid is rye, but that's not true. It's probably about 10%. And that's just that's just because of the conversion of starch to sugar to alcohol. If there's way less starch, you're going to get way less alcohol at the end. So that's the first thing. When you see our sort of grain ratios, what we call it, because mash bill would be sort of misleading. You'll see us say, oh, this is 86% or 83% corn, 16% rye, 1% malted barley. And people think, oh, that's a decent amount of rye. But why is the rye coming through so much? Well, it's coming through because that's the liquid ratio, not the mash bill, right? So that's really the first thing that most people don't know much about. The second main piece is probably that a bourbon has to be aged in new American oak. This is a law that dates back to the 1930s, passed by the lumber lobby. Very clever. Make everything have to be made in new oak. The Canadian whiskey does not have to be, which is actually fabulous because we work with a corn component that we absolutely love that spent 13 years in ex-bourbon and then was recast into new wood for 8 or 9, 10 years. And it doesn't get over oaked, right? A lot of your super old bourbons can be delicious, but the cost is pretty much always going to be a little bit of a bitter finish, a little bit of astringency. We don't have to deal with that. The next piece is probably the distillation strength and the filling strength. By law, bourbon has to be at least, it can't be distilled above 180 proof. It can't be put in barrel above 125. Canadian doesn't have those restrictions. They do a myriad different distillation methods, techniques. They do double column distilled. They do column into pot the way that a lot of bourbon distilleries do it. They do single column distilled. They do single pot distilled. They do basically everything. American whiskey tends to be pretty straightforward. You do a stripping run. You do a doubler. So you do like column into pot, and that's basically it. On your Scotch side of things, blended Scotch looks a lot like Canadian whiskey, except that they're very often pulling whiskey from different distilleries. The Scots are always trading barrels with each other so they can make their different blends. Canadians rarely do that. They pretty much make all the different styles all in-house and then blend all in-house. That's actually a little different for us. We move around a bit.
And they're also, just to clarify, they're pulling barrels of whiskey from different distilleries that are a combination of a variety of together in mash bill, versus Canadian, you're distilling only corn and putting only corn in a barrel, or am I getting this wrong?
Canadian we would do corn, we do wheat, we do rye, we do barley.
Yeah, all in separate barrels.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's a big distinction between the Scotch.
Yeah. Okay. And then single malt Scotch, everything, again, really much more restricted, right? It has to be one distillery, has to be pot distilled, and then aged, of course, for a couple of years at least.
This style has to be a craft distiller's dream to be able to work within these parameters or lack of parameters, maybe. Why do we not see more? Is it maybe a theoretical question? Why do we not see more kind of craft Canadian brands with these kind of cult followings the way that we see emerging here in the US? Or is it just an issue of like distribution and such?
That's a super interesting question. First of all, I think you are starting to see that. So if you look at particularly on the West Coast, there's some really great ones, but also on the East Coast, there is a craft distillation movement happening in Canada. Shelter Point would be a great example of a whiskey that I think is really well made and a distillery that's really doing some cool stuff. But there are a number of them. I think in terms of the sort of craft non-distiller producer or craft blender, it's a good question. I think they're just a little bit, they just haven't quite reached that point in their trajectory. I wouldn't be surprised if you see more of it. And hopefully we're able to sort of help generate a renaissance and enthusiasm for blending Canadian whiskey at the sort of high end for the enthusiast drinker. But I don't really see any reason why it isn't done in Canada. I think the reason why you don't see US brands doing it as much is most producers that don't distill are looking for whiskeys that are already ready to go. And so there's a mindset amongst non-distiller producers for the most part, and this is changing somewhat, but over the past decade and beyond, the mindset is let's find whiskey that's ready to be bottled. And the goal is mostly hunting down something exciting And that started, I think, with the cask strength movement, right? Like before things were cask strength, like now so much whiskey's cask strength, but 15 years ago, there was much less cask strength whiskey on the market. And so there was this opportunity, and yet consumers really liked it. And the reason for that is it has much more intense flavor. At least that's what we find. The flavor concentration within cask strength is really compelling, and the texture. And so what happens from my perspective is some of these non-distilling producers started filling this gap for cask strength whiskey. And that was a value add. And I think now there's probably less opportunity to add value in that way because distilleries are releasing their own versions of cask strength products. There's many cask strength products on the market. There's tons of cask strength MGP. And so you are seeing some transition into blending. But the disadvantage that we see for those producers is that American whiskey is not designed for blending. And so that's why I think Canadian is so compelling for us is it's designed for blending. But I think that's the reason that the sort of movement towards non-distiller production in the American whiskey market, you haven't seen as many producers bottling Canadian whiskey because one, it's further, like you got to figure it out, right? It's in Canada. It's not just MGP. And two, it's not something you want to bottle without blending. And that's not the mindset of most American non-distilling producers. So I think that's the big distinction.
This might be a little in the weeds, but when you're looking for like older spirits that have had time aging, is there more of it, I guess, available in Canada per, I guess, capita produced just due to the climate? I know like half of the battle in Kentucky of aging whiskey is just evaporation.
Yeah, so I think there's two factors that go into the availability. Well, the availability of older whiskeys has to do with both production process and market forces. In terms of the production processes that allow Canadian whiskey to get older, like we have a release we're working on with 27-year-old whiskey in it. That's very hard to do with American whiskey. And part of it is climate, as you mentioned, certainly, but part of it also has to do with regulations around maturation. So if you want to call something a straight bourbon, it's got to be a new charred American oak. And Canadian whiskey is not restricted in that way. And so if you're using new oak, it's more extractive. And so the longer you leave it in the barrel, the more barrel influence you're going to get. And if you're using new wood versus reused oak, that's really going to impart flavor more quickly or a barrel extraction more quickly than if you are using reused oak. And so it has to do with climate, but it also has to do with what kind of wood the whiskey is aging in. And that's what Nick was referring to earlier. We have this wonderful whiskey that spent 8 years in new wood, but the first 13 was in reused oak. And so it allows the development of other characteristics in the whiskey without the wood overpowering it as it gets older.
That's so interesting to think about. I mean, I'm actually studying for a little like Scotch certification. I don't even think they're like real, but I've been diving into that as well. And the idea of an active cask versus a non-active cask. And then the ongoing debate of, are there peaks and troughs in terms of development? How do you guys go about, and I know we don't need to talk about the distilleries you work with, but how do you guys go about like, number one, like locating these quality producers? And then do you get to go, are you barrel tasting like cask by cask, or are you doing lots? Like how are you selecting these spirits to blend?
We're very, very selective about what we get. So we would never buy something that we don't taste, first of all. So we don't buy anything just because it has a high age statement or anything like that. Everything we select, we think is a very compelling whiskey. So we taste a lot more than we acquire, obviously. And so that's one thing is we try to taste this. I mean, if we can taste something, we're going to taste it, right? Like we want to get the broadest exposure to the available options as possible. And once we do that, sometimes we know right off the bat, hey, this is a really compelling component and it's going to add a lot of value to a lot of our blends. Or sometimes we want to try it in a few blends and see what it brings to the table. But that's basically our selection process, is stringent tasting and then trying some sample blends and seeing how it works with our other whiskeys. Another piece of that is supply planning, right? So if we want to make whiskeys that have both rye, corn, wheat, barley, and we're short on one of those grains, we need to make an emphasis on identifying the gaps in the whiskeys we want to make. In terms of the suppliers themselves, that's really a relationship thing. And it's not trivial. Like you can't go on buycanadianwhiskey.com and find all the available stocks and just snag what you want and say, hey, send me over like 5,000 samples of all these whiskeys from all these different producers. You really have to develop the relationship, and there's give and take in that. And like, it takes time. And we've had some really terrific relationships that started well before we launched Found North that allowed us to get some access and some flexibility. I mean, for us, we're not a big brand. We're not a huge company that came into Canadian whiskey and said, hey, we want to make a 1 million case brand or whatever, a 100,000 case brand. It's a huge opportunity for you. Let's make this huge project. We're saying like our first blends were, hey, we only want 5 barrels. And it's very difficult to get a large producer to care about selling you 5 barrels. And so a lot of that has to do with the relationship, because you have to do something. You have to present to them, hey, we want to do something. This is a project. We think it's exciting. We think it can help Canadian whiskey. We really like what you guys are doing. Here's our future notion of what we can be and how we can partner with you guys. It takes that kind of cultivation.
Talk a little bit about your kind of the community that you've built around Found North and your customers. Obviously, with any new brand, your first customers are super important. They kind of set the trajectory for how your whiskey is experienced for the next 10x customers. Who is your customer that you found? What kind of whiskey drinker are they? Where are they based? And just talk a little bit about the kind of community around the whiskeys as you've gotten into your first, is it 7 releases? Or I guess you have more than 7, but
Yeah,
you talk about
I think it's really interesting for us. We're pretty unusual as whiskey makers because most of our team comes from the sales side of whiskey. So a lot of times people who make whiskey or start new brands started in production, which seems to make a lot of sense. But for us, we're like, our team is made up of two former brand ambassadors, a bartender, retail. I was working in retail as a whiskey director for a chain of retailers. Like that, we really came from the other side of this, and that's been great for a couple of reasons. One is it's great from a production standpoint, believe it or not, because we've tasted 1 million whiskeys, right? When you're making buying decisions, you just taste so much all the time. And so we really had a broad perspective on whiskey in general, which is unusual. And then on the other hand, what was great was we developed over years a bit of a following very locally in Massachusetts. So we launched this brand in Massachusetts. We're from Massachusetts. And as a whiskey buyer, my whole gig when I was just really starting up was educating people on whiskey. And it's amazing how enthusiastic, serious whiskey drinkers are. I used to joke that whiskey drinking for some people is like golf for other people. It's the only thing they want to do. And I don't think most people who are outside of the industry don't fully appreciate that this is a hobby that's as intense as wine. And there really has, I mean, it's developed incredibly over the last 10 years. But when I started in whiskey, when we started in whiskey, there wasn't much of that. The educator, there isn't a W set, as Billy knows, for whiskey, even though W set now covers spirits, but there wasn't before. Really, there was no formal way to be a trained whiskey expert. And so there weren't very many of them. And so there's this enormous contingent of people who are obsessed with whiskey, and they're getting fed BS stuff about how whiskey's made, what actually matters in it. And so our team, before we even started Found North, had spent years developing a following of people who trusted us because we said, this is what's really actually impacting the whiskey. This is the history. This is how the history affects the production processes, and this is how the production processes affect the flavor. And so through that process, we developed the following, but we also developed a pretty strong ethos of being upfront as much as we frankly legally can be about how our whiskey is made, the decisions that we made from a production standpoint. Zach, when we started, we talked about whether transparency was a core tenet of our brand. And Zach said, no, it's table stakes. Basically what Zach was saying was like, this isn't, we don't believe that, hey, we're about transparency. It was like, no, transparency is the baseline. We want to add value beyond just telling people what it is. We want people to be able to engage with the hobby as fully as they can. And as the producers, we have just this incredible opportunity to do that, right? We get to say why we made every little decision that we made, and make whiskey more than just an alcoholic drink in a glass. And that created some pretty passionate people early on with Found North who believed us, literally just believed us, period. Believed what we were doing, not believed in us, believed us. Like, we were telling the actual truth about the brand, hell, we called it Found North, right? We couldn't have been more upfront about the fact that we were sourcing this from Canada. So I think that our whiskey drinker became passionate whiskey drinkers because of that. It also is a bit of an identifier. We do very well with people who aren't drinking whiskey as a status symbol. We do well with people who are drinking whiskey because they absolutely love the category and are fascinated by where this giant ship that is whiskey is going next. And we think it could go back to, frankly, to Canada a little bit. And we'd like to be driving that ship a little bit. And I think that's the customers who are looking for that journey are looking for Found North.
Something that I've noticed that's a big difference between wine and whiskey is price sensitivity of the consumers, even enthusiast consumers. Your guys' product is not cheap by measure of actual cost or by quality, for that matter. How do you enter a market that way as like a new producer? And what has sort of the feedback been? Wine enthusiasts regularly drop $75 to $200 a bottle on something they get 5 glasses of wine out of, but whiskey drinkers start getting worked up if you creep over 100. So have you had that experience, or is some of that perspective unfounded, and how have you navigated if so?
Yeah, to be honest, the feedback on pricing has been pretty good for us. The biggest measure of price, I think, and value, and Nick obviously knows this as well as anybody coming from retail, to me is mostly about age compared to dollars. And I mean, of course, there are other factors like scarcity, proof, right? Quality, obviously. But I think age to dollars is what a lot of people look at as sort of the benchmark. And I think we've been able to come out with things that people think are high value. And that has to do with the ratio of age to dollars. And I think going back to our target customer base and who our customers are, because of this sort of hobby that Nick talked about that's developed over the last decade, people find whiskeys that resonate with them. You don't have to flash a million advertisements for someone to find Found North. In fact, we know that for a fact because we have not flashed. I don't think we've paid for an advertisement, maybe once or twice. And yet a lot of folks have found us. And the reason for that is there is a community. And so if you make whiskey that is compelling, you don't need to spend tons and tons of dollars on marketing and advertising to find people, right? And that's a change. And so that has allowed us to deliver value. That and the fact that Canadian whiskey, there's more availability of old stocks. Like, you can't go out as a non-distiller and just grab 18-year-old American whiskey. This is completely not doable. And so I think from a price perspective, people have been pretty happy with the price to age and the fact that we're able to deliver old whiskeys that aren't almost impossible to get. That's not like really doable in American whiskey. You're just not seeing 18-year-old whiskeys that are cask strength that are readily available. And so I think from both a value perspective and an availability perspective, we're bringing something to American whiskey drinkers that they're looking for.
There's also been enormous price creep with American whiskeys.
Sure.
And you used to get 10-year-old whiskey for $30, right? You could buy Eagle Rare in 2014. You could buy Eagle Rare any day of the week. It had a big 10-year age statement on it, and it cost $29.99. Right? Everybody misses those days. And now brands will come out with 4-year-old barrel-proof whiskey that's sourced from probably Indiana, and it's $100 a bottle. And so for us, when someone says, "Hey, this is of the profile that you're looking for, the quality's better, it's 18 years, and it's relatively close to the same price," it's actually been a good value proposition for consumers.
Yeah, I think when you guys were talking about the community and the wine nerds, or not wine nerds, sorry, whiskey nerds, I'm kind of one of those people too. I got into wine the same way, and I've gotten into whiskey by learning the processes and more like reading about what makes things taste the way they do, rather than going from here's a brand my dad used to drink, let me just drink that. And I think there's so much, the younger generation I've seen is also in doing this with wine, is they enjoy the story. They want to learn about how it's made. And I think you just have more to talk about, which I think is interesting. Your transparency lends itself to telling more of a story about, rather than this is just a brand, you should like it because the master distillery is great. It's more, here's why this is great. Have you seen that kind of contribute not only to growing your community in terms of a one-on-one sense, but even like working with distributors? Like I was at K&L out here in LA and I saw your guys' bottles on the shelves. Have you had that story be easier to tell in like the retail space as well as with direct to consumer?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're really excited. We started working with PM Spirits in New York City. They're in New York State, I should say. We've admired their ability to bring brands to life from a story perspective, which isn't always something that distributors are particularly equipped for. And to be fair, distributors used to have 4 whiskeys that they represent, and now they have 400, right? You look at bourbon distilleries in 2000, there were 50 of them. In like 2020, I think there were 1,800 of them. The ability for the distributor to differentiate and sort of know the difference between 7 bourbons that are all sourced from the same place. That's hard. That's a hard story to tell. Whereas with Found North, we're often distributors. Well, we only have a couple of distributors who've done a lot of self-distributing, but we're often the only premium Canadian whiskey in their bag, right? And so that alone makes it a little bit easier of a story to tell. From a retail level, when we're in front of an audience, it's a really fun story to tell. It's really fun because it's not the same gig. It's not the same origin story. We get to sort of dip into a lot of my favorite kind of historical things, and we get to bring a category that people are less familiar with to life, which is, I mean, it's about as exciting as making the whiskey itself.
Actually, I want to piggyback on that too. Billy, I think you talked about the transparency in our brand, giving us more material to really engage folks with, which is 100% true. But the other factor I would say that is beneficial for us in that regard is that each of our whiskeys is different. So if you are making like a 12-year that's always meant to taste the same, how much can you engage with folks around that, right? It's the same story. It's the same whiskey. Why it tastes the way it tastes is the same reasons, right? And so each of our whiskeys has been a progression, and it's taken Found North in a different direction. And so the story is unfolding as we go, and it keeps changing, and each chapter is different. And so I think that approach, and by the way, the fact that we're focused on blending as opposed to distilling the same thing every time, just gives us a much wider variety of whiskeys to talk about, and a much wider variety of variables that are going into what makes the whiskey taste the way it does. And so that also gives us the ability to really engage with people, and it keeps us interested, by the way. We're not just out here trying to do the same thing over and over and over and over and just market it better. We're trying to create a succession of really cool, really interesting, high quality whiskeys.
While many producers take the approach of sort of building out and rounding out a portfolio of whiskeys, you guys are really building an archive, right? Of where, like you say, where you've been and kind of where the brand is headed. How are you currently thinking about expanding the archive? What does the next, just say, 5 years look like in terms of planning without giving away what your next batch releases are? But you have 7. I'm looking at batch 007. I believe that's your most recent. Is that correct, that you sent us the sample?
Yep.
So how many unique whiskeys have you actually released to the public?
Yeah. So we've had 7 batches, and then we have a single barrel program that's very different from the notion of American single barrels. But the way we do that is we create a starting blend that becomes the seed for our single barrels. And then we put it into a bunch of different finishing casks. And so each of those casks becomes unique, but they're all starting from the same foundational blend. Super different from the classic single barrel selection that you have in the US market. As a result, if you count each of those as a distinct whiskey, we've had maybe
17.
Nick, what,
17.
like 17? So we've had maybe 25 distinct whiskeys. But I would say if we count each, and those, so it depends how you do it. But if you count each season, which is the blend, the starting blend for our single barrels, we've had one season of single barrels. We're about to release our second season this fall. And we've had 7 distinct blends, each one being a batch with a number. And within that, we've had ryes that are mostly rye. We've had corns, and we've had one wheater, which has wheat as a secondary grain rather than rye. In terms of the future, Brady, that you talked about, I think it's a super, I could talk for a long time about that. And it's probably the thing, honestly, it might be the most talked about thing within our company in terms of, hey, we got to get everyone together. We got to figure out exactly what we want to make for the next 5 years or even next year. It's a challenge because I think when you first start, we only have 7 whiskeys. So the fact that they're all called batches isn't that confusing. There's only 7 of them. So it's pretty easy to go back and figure out what's what, right? But as you if you think about that over the course of 50 years and of 5 years, and you've got north of 50 batches, it gets a little bit confusing for the consumer. So I think for us, the core ethos is we want to keep creating new whiskeys. We want to keep doing what we just talked about, which is we want to keep innovating. And our focus is on how can we make new and interesting blends. And for us, I think the most interesting development from a product perspective that's coming up is we're working more with maturation. We're 2 years old. So when we started, everything was source it, blend it, release it. Now we're able to bring in bulk, understand our whiskeys, understand what different wood profiles will do to those whiskeys, and start shaping them as sort of this intermediary step before blending them or as a finishing step after blending. And so for us, I think finishes and further maturations is the next evolution of what we're going to see from John North.
Yeah, sorry, Billy, just real quick on the 2 labels that you sent over on the 007 and the 006. One says maturation, Hungarian oak, and the other says finished in, it looks like sherry cask. So finished in and matured in or maturation, those are different things.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Sorry. Yeah. The naming is the naming and the designations is challenging and gets us into these sticky spots because when we first did it, honestly, when we first designed the label, we wanted to include every maturation regimen for every component whiskey. But it looks ridiculous, right? I mean, it looks like a grocery list. It just looks silly. And there's a point where the aesthetics actually matter. And so we started putting on our website what the components were, what the intentionality was behind the blend. And on the blend itself, we would put whatever was the linchpin whiskey as the maturation. And so we wanted to shout out when we use something like Hungarian oak and then we build the entire whiskey around it, which we've done, 5 times. I mean, we absolutely love Hungarian oak. It's a dream to work with. And so when we say sort of maturation on one of our batch labels, that's really just saying this was the maturation of the whiskey that the whole thing is built around, because we have 5 different whiskeys in here that have 5 different maturation regimens. Some of them have gone from ex-bourbon into new oak or ex-bourbon into Scotch cask or whatever it is. And if we listed that all out, it would just be too much. That being said, when we do this process that Zach's talking about, where we basically make a blend and then we finish it in something, that's when we'll put the quote unquote finished designation. So the batch 6-S, which you guys have, which we call Second Summit, we made batch 6 and we had a beautiful Pedro Jimenez Spanish oak sherry butt. And as you guys know probably from wine, but also from Scotch, getting real Spanish oak is incredibly difficult. And getting really good Spanish oak Pedro Jimenez sherry butts is really difficult. And we had it and we had batch 6 done, and we had been doing this thing where we were making blends and then putting them into finishing casks. And we said, all right, what would happen if we took some batch 6 and we put it in this Pedro Jimenez sherry butt, and it was spectacular. I mean, it did marvelous, beautiful things to the whiskey. And so that is the difference in, say, when we say maturation versus saying finished. I know it's not the most straightforward thing, but that's the best we got from a language standpoint.
That's super helpful. Yeah. So,
so you can, they're used to achieve different things. So the intermediary maturations give us more paints, right? They give us more things to use when we go to create the blends. And so they're about sometimes just creating diversity in the portfolio of whiskeys that we have to create. The finishes have a more specific intent in mind. So when we make a blend that we intend to be finished, we leave room for specific finishes that we anticipate will bring certain profile to the whiskey. So they're sort of two different tools that we use to achieve two different ends.
Yep. And like you were saying, certain casks, 100% charred American oak is going to give off long term. It's not something maybe you want to leave it in for the 18 years, whereas a second use Scotch cask that maybe was bourbon and it was refinished and came back is better for something that's a little longer term and mellow. And then you could put something intense like a PX sherry cask at the very end for a little bit. That makes a ton of sense. I actually just had a PX sherry last week. So when I had your whiskey, it was the first time I've actually had one of those wines within a small window of having the sherry that was finished in it. It's kind of pretty cool to kind of see the elements come through. My question on the finishing and the aging was, since you guys are going to be maturing more on your own, where is that in Massachusetts too? I see one of these was aged in New Hampshire. Do you have your own kind of storage facility now that you're kind of managing?
Yeah, we have a warehouse in New Hampshire. So it's quite close and it's quite useful.
That's cool. Also where we have sort of the bottling line and the blending facilities. So all the stuff that we do to the whiskey, once we bring it into the US, that's where it happens.
So are you going to continue to buy younger spirit alongside some of this older stuff and then eventually just raise some stuff all the way up that might be 18 years from now that you're buying that's new make? Or are you buying things that are still with some time on them and then you're kind of just finishing them up in your facilities?
Yeah, so this stuff is so complex. The supply planning is such a challenge in whiskey making at large, not just for us, but you really have to be thinking 5, 10, 15, 20 years out, which is both cool and a massive challenge, especially for a young brand as we're still sort of defining ourselves, right? But our perspective is if we can buy 20-year-old delicious whiskeys, we'll buy those first. We'll focus on buying new make later. There's a lot of new make that's available, right? Like it's much easier to find new make than it is to find really great 20-year-old components. So candidly, our strategy is let's buy all these epic old components and we have greater faith that we can fill in younger whiskey if we choose to do that. And to your point, probably, Billy, just kind of control the destiny of those whiskeys a little more, right? Get them a little earlier on, control the maturation from day one, contract distill. Those are all sort of things we could potentially move into as we want to gain control. But as it is right now, we have so much control over the whiskey because of the blending process that we are pretty content to buy terrific old components that we can make really tasty blends with, and then start to use wood and develop that as sort of our next frontier. But those are the two areas we want to focus on. So I think in the immediate term, certainly our focus is on continuing to source aged product.
That totally makes sense. I was just gonna say, Brady, before you hop in, I was thinking about it in the lens of like another Scotch parallel. Like Gordon MacPhail just basically said they're going to stop buying new make, and people were like, "Oh man, what are they going to do?" But then they've been around for 100 years, so they still have 70 through 1-year-old whiskey just aging in their thing, and then they're going to have their own distillery. And it's really interesting to picture something with you guys being able to source this older spirit that's a blending component rather than somebody who's trying to focus on single malt Scotch that's supposed to be. Yeah.
Right. That's why, like when I look at comparables within the Scotch space, I look more at Compass Box versus Gordon MacPhail, right? So like when we think about the people that we really admire and that we want to be like, we look at the folks who have really pioneered categories and who have blended really effectively. And I think Compass Box is an example of both those things within Scotch. Whereas I think Gordon MacPhail, who we own a lot of Gordon MacPhail, been to Gordon MacPhail, love Gordon MacPhail. It seems to me that I know them mostly for single malt bottlings.
Exactly.
And that's just very, very different from what we're trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very different. Now that makes so much sense. One other question. Are you guys experimenting with, so you said wood is a new frontier. Are you trying out a bunch of new wood? Are you trying some of that? I forgot what the Pacific Northwest oak is called, but are you trying to do that?
Mariana.
And bring in like Mariana, and then there's like Mizunara from Japan. Are you guys going like that way, or are you going still with the sherry and some of the more traditional finishing casks before getting?
Nick, I'm going to go ahead and answer three or four questions in a row. I don't care what you have to say later about it because I want this one. No, I mean, I think, yeah, totally. And that's what's beautiful about our single bar program, actually, because we start with a centralized blend. It gives us like a control, and then we put it in a bunch of different wood, and that teaches us about what the woods do to our whiskeys. So for one, yes, we definitely want to try a wide range of wood, see what it gives us, right? Really get to know what it gives us, especially around components that we have a lot of. What can we do with these components to create some diversity and that's going to be able to give us a different profile for future blends? So number one, yes, we want to try a bunch of different wood. In terms of sort of Gariana, Mizunara, these really, like there are some woods. It's been interesting. Like you've seen these woods sort of gain the real excitement around them for 3 years, and then people move on to the next super cool, like en vogue wood type. I'd say we just want to use the wood that we think is going to make the best wood. We don't want to just throw on Mizunara aged and charge triple, right? Like that's not the strategy. And so we're always a little reticent about chasing trends. And so we really want to make ourselves, like our whole strategy is to focus on making great whiskey. And we believe that everything else will take care of itself. And so we don't want to chase a wood type that's super, super expensive or hard to get, or we can only get like a low quality cask because everybody's bought up all the good ones. We'd rather just keep doing, for example, sherry, which is like pretty standard, right? Like not a super sexy new wood type, but contributed enormously to the flavor profile of Batch 6 Second Summit. So that's kind of how we do it. So we'll look at what's available and we'll think about how it's going to affect the whiskey, and we'll make decisions accordingly.
Yeah, I was just getting into some of the samples that you sent over to us, Billy. Do you have notes on the samples, or I know you had to kind of guzzle them down before we got on, but did you make any notes? I wanted to talk a little bit about the 007 at least before we wrap up here.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to chat about that. I think when we do our our other intro more, I'll have more in depth, but I definitely have initial thoughts if you want to go first.
I mean, I was just going to comment on, I mean, even by cask strength standards, going to be one of the hotter whiskeys by ABV on the shelf. I mean, I'm thinking about maybe the Stag lines. I mean, George T, I think got up to 70%, 140 proof at one point. But so many producers, especially of American whiskey, bourbon, I feel like produce whiskey and bottle it at cask strength just kind of for the sake of writing cask strength on the label. I don't think I've had a more grown up and restrained and refined and well integrated cask strength whiskey. I mean, just floored me in terms of how the volume of alcohol holds up all the components, hold them together really well, shines through. The finish is extremely long without burning you to death the way that, I won't name names, some of the cask strength whiskeys that are released on an annual basis from the larger producers. But I thought it was just incredible in terms of how well integrated the alcohol was and didn't feel unnecessary at any step, which that's kind of have actually moved away from cask strength whiskey, especially in bourbon because of that. So great job. Really good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. Just to add from my side, I was surprised. Well, one, I tasted them obviously straight and then added a couple drops of water, but they didn't really even need that. To Brady's point, they were both round, had immense layers of like depth to begin with. So that was really cool. Something that I noticed off the bat was more of that expression of rye. And I was surprised that there was like 16 in the 007 that I tried. And in the Second Summit, there was only 12%. But to your guys' point earlier, it's really interesting to kind of see how that nuance and balance kind of came through and the expression of the rye, even with the small percentages, because it was the liquid rather than the thing.
I had the exact same. I was disappointed when I read the label. I was like, I only see it because I'm like, what in this am I going to love? Because it's cash strength. I'm like, not excited. Rye, it's super low. So much corn. And then just completely, blew me away. The rye comes through like
spice.
Really well done. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. It's interesting because you can imagine the question. I mean, probably the question we get most at tastings is, what's your favorite batch? And it's, we put a lot of energy into getting them right, or as right as we can. And with seven's actually the highest proof that we've released at 131.8. And I felt like the thing we did best with that whiskey was integrating it well enough where you don't even believe the proof. It's hard to believe the proof, because I've completely had that experience where proof for proof's sake is not something we're going for. And honestly, we had this incredible component. We had a 1998 vintage corn component that was aged exclusively in first fill ex-bourbon. And what's interesting about these corn components is if they have a new wood, they usually express new wood really well in a very clean way. You get tannin, you get sweetness, you get vanillins, you get what you expect. And if they're in, and you also get body. And if they're in ex-bourbon or used wood, the corns usually bring a lot of really interesting top notes, which is, pretty straightforward, right? They get more oxidation, less over oaked, but they tend to be a little higher on the flavor profile. I don't know why, but I always think of things as sort of on the high to low scale. You get more top notes, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you don't get, it's often a little thinner, right? It's like they could be a little thinner. This 98 corn component was just best of both worlds. It had body, it had this really lovely, almost like Werther's caramel note, and it brought like these beautiful floral fruit notes. And that actually opened up a world of things for us to do, because we really didn't have to kind of coax the whiskey on both sides of the profile. We had this corn that brought everything from top to bottom that we needed. And it actually allowed us to bring a lot of rye spice to the profile. That rye that was 18 years, 11 months and change. Yep. We could have let it age for 3 weeks, I think, and called it a 19 year, but we were afraid it was going to age out of profile. So we just blended it. But that rye, that was aged in Hungarian oak, is an absolute spice bomb. It's actually a little unwieldy at times because it's so damn spice forward, that we find when we're blending that it's about a 6-to-1 ratio of spice of fruit to spice to keep them in balance. So if you have something that's fruity and something that's spicy and you put them in equally, the spice will absolutely nuke the fruit out of the water. So this really high sort of spice component rye is really fun to work with, really challenging to work with. But this 98 vintage corn just set the stage so beautifully that it integrated extremely well.
I feel like I found some like citrus, like maybe dried orange peel, or that some of those, maybe like a toasted or caramelized orange kind of thing. And that citrus note, or it could have been more of the floral components that you're talking about. I'm trying to look back through my notes, but I feel like that's a key link between the sort of classic vanilla, caramel, heavy, like sweeter kind of notes and those rye notes.
Yep.
I don't know where that citrus comes from, and maybe it does come from the rye, but I feel like that's a key link and something that I wouldn't often find. I feel like at a whiskey this high proof or with that high of corn, maybe too, they wouldn't be able to detect that.
Rye, actually, it's really interesting. The ryes we've worked with that are in some form of used oak have incredibly beautiful fruit and floral notes, which is shocking because if you drink American rye, it's almost always young, so it doesn't have a lot of time to develop those characteristics. And if it happens to be old, it's almost always in new wood, so it doesn't get a chance to show those characteristics. We were blown away when we started drinking like 16, 17, 18-year-old ryes that were in used wood. And we were like, since when was rye this sort of citrusy and floral and fruit forward? We had no idea. But the problem, of course, is there's an expectation that rye will bring the baking spices. And so in this particular whiskey, that citrus actually was coming from the 98 component. And that was why it was such a fun whiskey to blend with, because it really allowed us to have a heavy dose of 24-year-old corn that was bringing both the fruit and enough body that it didn't become kind of thin, and they can get thin and kind of almost like effervescent up into the roof of your palate, which I don't really like. I want my whiskey to land and hit and coat my entire palate, not kind of get up in the roof of your mouth. So having that ability to bring both was very, very unique, and really we'll use that component again. That's for damn sure.
You have to have that settling component with a whiskey of that higher proof. Otherwise, it just blows it out, for me at least. And yeah, it was definitely coating, like you said. That was a good explanation. Appreciate it. Billy, do you have anything else on the others? Or we can talk, like you said, we can talk about it in the intro, but just wanted to give you your flowers while you're on.
And it was just cool to have the two next to each other to really experience kind of not only the little bit of flavor impact of the maturation and the PX sherry, but also just like the mouthfeel of the two, that like the roundness that the sherry cask contributed was really cool. So that was my main other takeaway between these two before my more elaborate notes.
I was just going to say on that sherry cask, the really interesting thing about the two different approaches that we generally have for making whiskey, one where we're making the blend and then the blend is done, and one where we're finishing the blend, is when you're finishing the blend, and I couldn't tell you the exact science behind it, but even just sitting and settling for several months in a cask, it integrates extremely well. And then the flavors get their own sort of coating of whatever the previous spirit was. And that tightens it up and makes it really like very clean. Whereas when we're just doing the straight blends, man, you have to be precise. Holy cow, you have to be really precise. 1 percentage point changes completely change the whiskey. And until you're blending, you would never believe that. If it is 30, 30, 20, 20, or whatever your 4 components are, and you change one to 19 and the other to 21, the whiskey goes all over the place really quickly. And that part of it is really fun because it can take you in interesting directions. But holy cow, is it hard. I mean, it's really, really difficult to get it where you want it.
We did a blending thing when we were in Kentucky, and even I completely understand just like doing the little droplets. We were just one little drop of this or that. It was crazy how much it would change it. I can imagine at scale, it's crazy as well.
We're just up on time here. What's I guess maybe just 2 minutes on how can either consumers or maybe just the industry more broadly work to better support maybe like craft distillers, early stage distillers? Is there something that really should be happening from a retail level upwards or from a distributor level upwards to help support the industry? Or is it really just about continuing to build community and coming direct?
Yeah, I mean, I think you nailed it right there. Continuing to build community, because the more that folks find the whiskeys that resonate with them and share it with other folks, that is what makes it easier for new brands, be they craft distillers or non-distiller producers or blenders, to enter the market effectively without having to have a massive amount of advertising dollars and huge distributor partnerships. So I think community is the answer. It's worked for us really, really effectively already. So we've seen how powerful it is, because our number one marketing tool is someone liking our whiskey and sharing it with someone else. And the more the community is developed, the faster and more integrated folks are, the easier it is for new brands that are doing something compelling, that are resonating with those folks, the easier it is for them to break in. So I think that's the number one thing that supports new brands.
Awesome. Yeah, well, we'll hope that the podcast gives a little bit of exposure, and hope we can share it out in the networks. And I know our listeners, we've just gotten into doing more whiskey kind of spotlights, and just our second producer that we've had on the whiskey side. Really glad to have you and think you're doing great. Yeah, great stuff for the space, not just for Canadian whiskey, but for whiskey across North America. So I really appreciate you guys. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're really, really delighted that you guys found us, and we're so happy to have been on the show. Really enjoyed it. Thank you so
Awesome.
much.
Yeah. Talk to you again soon. Okay.
Cheers.
Thanks, Aaron.
All right. That was our interview with Nick and Zach Taylor of Found North Whisky. I hope everybody enjoyed basically the way they could play off each other and really explain whiskey and what they're doing with it in a very approachable and understandable way. I think I came out with a much deeper understanding of whiskey, and I hope everybody did as well, and also goes to find their whiskeys wherever they are sold. So until next week, cheers.
To check out our current offerings and to sign up for the Vint platform, find us at www.vint.co. That's www.vint.co. For questions, comments, or feedback on the Vint podcast, please email us at support@vint.co. Vint and VV Markets are offering securities pursuant to Regulation A. Our offering circulars amended can be found on the SEC website. Past performance is no guarantee of future results. Investments such as those on the Vint platform are speculative and involve substantial risks to consider before investing. We may provide communication that may contain certain forward-looking statements that are subject to various risks and uncertainties. Information provided in any communications, including this podcast, is not legal, business, or tax advice. All prospective investors should consult a legal, tax, or business advisor concerning the subject matter of any communications and any offering.